Hello, so today we're going to discuss um, the readings about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we'll talk about victimhood from a theoretical perspective. So I should let you know that while a lot of the readings are really factual in nature, and sometimes the authors offer a journalistic style of reporting, my background is in theory and is largely in post colonial theory, anti racist theory, feminist theory, queer theory, um, Marxist theories. So I'm more familiar with teaching classes that focus on theory, and what the lectures will often focus on are the theoretical and philosophical questions that the authors offer. So, in the article that draws on Michelle Bakhtin about the Carnivalesque and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the victim-centered approach that the Canadian state took in discussing the abuse that Indigenous people have faced. Uh, I'm interested in discussing the idea of victimhood itself and what it means to be a victim. So, this lecture will really focus on the politics of victimization and why certain stories of victimhood um, become saleable in the media, and what it means to tell a story, um, and also to cast characters in a story. Frantz Fanon once wrote that every generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it out of relative opacity. The last years have uh, offered the chance to bear witness to many social movements throughout the world that have been remarkable. Um, Indigenous politics has been in the news over and over again um, for many years. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and most obviously, protests over land and pipelines have really demonstrated some of the overarching political questions that we are asked to consider. The Wet'suwet'en protests, for example, um, created a great deal of media attention and also leave one with a lot of philosophical questions and theoretical questions regarding responsibility and regarding the future political goals of the Canadian state. and also regarding the law.
How are you? Back with you on Off the Hook Radio. It's DJ Buddha Blaze. You know, electric power hour is going on tonight. That's right, a tribe called Red. Are you going to check them out? Give me a call. Let me know. Let's get into the latest from nation to nation. This is Sisters.
In February of 2020, protesters across Canada, across Turtle Island, across the country, joined the blockades in support of hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en Nation in British Columbia, who opposed the construction of a natural gas pipeline through their territory. Underlying the dispute were long-standing questions over land title and who speaks for Canada's Indigenous people, who speaks for Turtle Island's Indigenous people. Standoff poses a major challenge for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has found his promises to fight climate change, achieve reconciliations with Indigenous people, and support for Canada's oil and gas are frequently in tension. These ideas are perhaps frequently in tension with Justin Trudeau's fun hobby of blackface. So these questions about truth and reconciliation, I think, can never be separated or divorced from Canada's racism. I am a visibly racialized woman, and I think that Canada is an extremely racist country to live in. And so I think these questions about victimization and also land and the demonization of protesters cannot be separated from a wider ideology of whiteness as normative, innocent, nice, and as foundational to the building and the ongoing to the building of a colonial nation, the building of a colonized country, and to ongoing forms of genocide. So throughout the lecture, we'll discuss victimization and who is constructed as a perfect victim. I'll also compare Canada's ongoing seizure of land and assaults on women as symbolic of, but also materially part of a seizure of land to India's seizure of lands in occupied Kashmir, and also other efforts to seize land in the Indian subcontinent. I do find it interesting to think about these issues as well from a legal perspective. There are many things that are not possible to, I think, even articulate in the context of colonial rule. The glaring absence of any understanding of racism and systemic racism and whiteness in white settler Canada is, I think, part of what it means to live under colonial rule. Sexual violence and gender based violence are often thought of in interpersonal terms. So, the ways that sexual violence and gender based violence are often made sense of are is through a discourse of interpersonal relationships and interpersonal violence. And this kind of political nature of sexual violence, I think, is separate from this idea of personal sexual violence as being personal refuses to see the political nature of sexual violence, or refuses to acknowledge the political nature of sexual violence and the ways that sexual violence is always connected to land and the politics of land theft and seizure of land. Um, the history of slavery and the racialization of Black people is also obviously about land and forced labor. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report documents Canada's ongoing violence um, as the country expands. Hate crimes also rise, and there are growing forms of anxiety concerning the body, and particularly concerning the bodies of women and visibly racialized women and Indigenous women. There is the sense that people find it funny to abuse others. There's also a sense that the commodification of non-white women's bodies is acceptable. And there is sometimes no sense of seriousness regarding certain people's lives. Throughout the ages, all societies have taken care to ensure the safety of the members of their communities. And yet, still today, the World Health Organization reports that 35% of women worldwide will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, this figure reflecting only violence that is reported. In Canada, statistics show that Indigenous women and girls are 12 times more likely to be murdered or missing than any other women in Canada. According to Statistics Canada, between 2001 and 2015, homicide rates for Indigenous women were nearly 6 times higher than for non-Indigenous women. A risk of such magnitude requires us all to take responsibility, to clearly identify the issue, and to take strong measures to address this situation, which is rooted in Canada's historical and political context. That said, statistics cannot convey what families and communities really go through when they lose loved ones to such violence. In a time of hate crime, which includes obviously hate crimes against Black people and women of color, um, I think it is important to think of the idea of loved ones. It is sometimes, I think, obvious that it is impossible for certain people to love other people because of skin color, because of poverty, because of name, because of an investment in seizing land for one's own narcissism and consumer-driven lifestyle, or for one's own purposes of becoming white and middle class. But what becomes really troubling in this time period is that people cannot often love other people, but they do want to use other people for branding or for forced labor or for diversity or as an outlet for one's abuse or comedy. And I think this is a really insidious passive aggressive form of middle class white racism that you see in cities like Toronto. I really hope that at some point in time, people in Canada take themselves seriously as colonizers. The concept of family means so much more than biological lineage, with the strength and diversity of a family being found in the sum of its parts. Each of them deserves to live in an environment where all of its members can develop their full potential safely and peacefully. I guess I do think that Canadians take themselves seriously as colonizers when it comes to money, but I almost wish that they would take themselves seriously as white people, in the ways that white nationalism has been quite honest in the United States of America. Passive aggression and lying, and wanting to use images to brand oneself as diverse while being brutally racist and not caring if certain people live or die or have a family, reproduce, have any quality of living at all, is kind of what to me sums up the city of Toronto and a lot of the ways that white middle class people behave. And I almost think it would be easier to deal with honesty rather than passive aggression, politeness, and endless forms of branding. It is obviously important that we all acknowledge that we are settlers. And this has been said over and over again. I think it's important to read the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. But what I also found was that as soon as there were more and more visibly racialized people in the university system as lawyers in institutional positions of power and making more money, it was really important for white people to say that we are all settlers. So we are all settlers.
I'm going to make a bold statement and say that
This person's making a bold statement.
doing a TEDx talk is going to be the most transformative and uplifting experience.
In late spring, the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls held a hearing in Whitehorse, part of its commitment to give family members a safe place in which to tell their stories.
We identified Mary through our family pictures with the morgue pictures. At least we knew where she ended up.
I grew up an only child, often wondering why my mother was not around.
Some 1,200 Indigenous women and girls have been murdered or gone missing since 1980. And for their families, this national inquiry was a hard-won victory.
I'm her voice. She can't speak for herself anymore. So I want them to know what the effects and what happens.
Yet 9 months into a 28-month process, the Whitehorse event was just the first set of hearings, leading to a widely held concern.
This is a process that no one should be rushing. We need to ensure this is done properly.
We're going to need some more time to get our work done in the way that we need to do it.
Great Spirit.
There were much deeper concerns than that. Advocacy groups and some families were critical of the way the inquiry was being run.
Many of their criticisms have centered around lack of communication, lack of information, lack of supports to attend any of these events, and a real lack of voice in all of this.
Around the time of those first hearings in Whitehorse, a respected former First Nations leader and father of the current Justice Minister let loose on social media. This wasn't just a communications issue. The inquiry was facing a crisis of legitimacy. The federal government believed the Whitehorse hearings might have helped quell those concerns.
Well, I think that people felt it turned a corner at Whitehorse. Yes. I think that the fact that the families felt listened to and that there seemed to be a real empathetic approach.
But over the summer, things took a turn for the worse. The biggest blow came in mid-July when one of the 5 commissioners did in fact quit. Marilyn Poitras said she could no longer serve the process the way it was designed.
My main concern is that this commission is going down a tried road. We've been studied, we've been researched, we've gone and looked at Indians and half-breeds and Inuit people for a long time to see what's the problem. You tell us your sad story and we'll figure out what to do with you, and we're headed down that same path. And if it worked, we would all be so fixed and healthy by now.
I think that resignation is extremely significant. It's saying this isn't just a staff issue. You know, we're not just having some growing pains in terms of people working for the commission, that there are fundamental and core flaws with the inquiry such that she didn't want to be affiliated with it anymore. She didn't want to cause more harm to the families.
After this, the calls for the lead commissioner to resign grew louder.
I have no intention of resigning. This is important work that we've already started, that we have planned for the future, and we intend to continue for the sake of the families and survivors.
The pressure intensified. In late July, the Assembly of First Nations voted on a measure demanding resignations of the remaining commissioners.
You failed in communications. You failed to build trust. You failed to build relationships with families.
But most First Nations leaders voted against that so-called hard reset.
More than 60% is not in favor.
And in favor of staying the course.
That inquiry is occupied by Indigenous commissioners, and I don't think we should be calling on the federal government to fix it.
Some people have some concerns around a reset of the inquiry. Some of the families in the North are worried that maybe their testimony will be deleted, or maybe there'll be no inquiry at all.
In August, inquiry leaders posted a reset document of their own, promising to work with families on the issues that were causing friction. And they stressed the inquiry was looking into the critical issue of policing.
I think that the leadership has shown a blatant disregard for the reality by pretending that everything is still okay. And it's clearly not okay.
For those who despair for the fate of the inquiry, recent history may offer some hope.
We have excellent precedent, and you'll recall that one didn't get started off so well either.
The well-received Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission did call for a reset before finding its footing.
And I am grateful that there are things that are going to be done about this now.
Late last month, during a cabinet shuffle, Prime Minister Trudeau's government split the Indigenous Affairs portfolio into 2 departments. Trudeau promised it won't impact the inquiry.
The missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry is actually the responsibility of.
So Justin Trudeau was elected as the hot feminist Prime Minister of Canada, the hot young white male Prime Minister of Canada, straight, cisgender male Prime Minister of Canada. And then he was reelected after black photos circulated of him doing blackface. And now he is helping to decolonize. Makes sense, I suppose, for someone who is a racist, but not to me.
The Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council office, and it remains.
Hi, I'm Russ Ruffino, and this is what.
One way that we can also think about how a context of racism structures the ongoing violence against Indigenous women and girls, which has been called a genocide, or part of an economic, a cultural, spiritual genocide, is to think about the criminal justice system. And I'll discuss Black Lives Matter throughout the class after the George Floyd protests. I think it is important to obviously talk about the criminal justice system and policing constantly. The protests that followed the murder of George Floyd, was an unarmed Black man who was killed by police in the United States, have been called the largest mass US protests in recent history. The ways that Indigenous women and girls are treated in the criminal justice system is really exemplary of what scholars refer to as systemic discrimination. What this means is that people are already not very nice to women and girls who look a certain way sometimes. I mean, not everyone, but there's obviously I can obviously think of many instances where people have not been very kind to me, and it probably is because I am a visibly racialized woman and I was a visibly racialized girl. And sometimes as you get older, the kind of things people say to you are less direct than just actual vulgarities about your skin color or body, but it's still kind of apparent that there is a lot of interpersonal violence. But systemic racism is obviously worse because it means that the criminal justice system is not a system that you can rely upon. And this is really true of the treatment of Indigenous women and girls in the criminal justice system. So the MMIWG states all women can turn to the justice system to ensure their safety. However, the testimony we heard during the community hearings made it clear that the justice system is poorly adapted to meet the needs and reality of Indigenous women and girls. For example, we heard about situations where after having reported assaults, the women were assaulted again by their attackers, even after the attacker had served time in prison. These stories demonstrate just how uncertain the outcome is for Indigenous women and girls when they file a complaint with the police. In this context, it is easy to understand how a fear of breaking the silence can outweigh the incentive to report the attacker. I think it is also interesting to think about the politics of settlement. So the majority of people who immigrate here from India are not Adivasi or tribal people or Dalits. So a lot of the Indian diaspora are Brahmins and Savarnas who represent upper caste Hindus. The people who are most policed in India and who go to jail in India are Muslims, Dalits, and Adivasis. And so one can think about how a lot of people who are part of diasporas who come here as immigrants are involved in one form of colonialism and settling of lands, and then move to a country like Canada or America to help white people or to help originary settlers settle land again. And I think what is interesting about thinking about intersectional feminism is to think about how being involved in the feminist movement and how being committed to being involved in the feminist movement changes one's relationship to men who settle lands. There is an old adage in India, a successful woman is the daughter of a rich man, the wife of a rich man, and the mother of a rich son. This is true of a lot of upper caste cisgender straight women who are part of the South Asian diaspora in North America. So one's allegiance to caste-based patriarchy and to upper caste Hindu men who are not Adivasis and who are not tribals and who are involved and whose success is really dependent on the displacement of others can carry out over generations. I think the feminist movement and the LGBTQ2S or the queer movement, sometimes they add letters to the English language acronym, so I don't want to offend anyone. The queer movement, one's participation in the queer and feminist movement can change their relationship to the politics of settlement and to men who are consistently always settling land. This is just my thinking. This doesn't mean that queer people of color and women of color who are part of the feminist movement are not privileged and obviously more privileged than Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women and girls. I think that the point is to think about how identity politics is really about politics. And what someone has said is that it is important to base your identity on your politics rather than your politics on your identity. And I think this is true about being part of the South Asian diaspora, because the politics of South Asia are really about the settling of land and the settling of Adivasi and tribal land and the displacement of Kashmiris, Adivasi and tribal people from their land. So rather than thinking about being proud of being Hindu or South Asian, I think it is important to base one's politics or to one's identity on their politics. The question of being in solidarity with people rather than appropriating other people's struggles, speaking on behalf of people, or benefiting financially from appropriating certain people's struggles or having coarse content or media about the death of women and girls is an ongoing question, and I think it is a moral and ethical and philosophical question that we all have to ask. In theory, anyone I think can be part of the feminist movement and be in solidarity with those who experience violence, but there will always be these lingering questions about privilege and how certain people make money and benefit economically from speaking on behalf of others. This has also been true in India and for the Indian feminist movement in the last few years. The Justice for Asifa campaign happened when I was living in India and working as a professor in Bangalore. And Asifa Banu is from the Bakarwal Muslim community, and Asifa is a child who was gang raped and murdered in Kathua in the district near Jammu, and this refers to Jammu and Kashmir, which is an area that critical theorists, feminists, and left-wing commentators would refer to as India-occupied Kashmir. The case caused public outrage after lawyers tried to prevent the state police from filing a charge sheet last week. The girl was heavily sedated, kept in a Hindu temple, and gang raped by at least 3 men over the course of 4 days in mid-January, the police said in the charge sheet made public on Tuesday. She was later strangled, and her body was found in the forest near the temple. One of the 3 suspected rapists was a policeman. Leaders from the Hindu nationalist BJP, which is now the ruling party in India, included 2 ministers from the Jammu and Kashmir government, organized rallies that defended the accused. The ministers were forced to resign on Saturday amid widespread public anger. The politics of seizing lands can never be separated from the politics of extreme violence against women and girls. So even this necklace is from India, and this kind of retention of handmade craft is something that you just see in streets, and when people buy jewelry in urban India from street vendors, you're never really sure about the origins of the person because they often just say that they made the jewelry themselves. But a lot of things like that are not modern and are not sold by multinational corporations like H&M and Zara are perhaps connected to tribal peoples or Adivasi peoples. It's sometimes really difficult in India to separate rural people in very rural places in certain parts of India from Adivasi or tribal peoples because there's so much intermixture. This is also, I think, true for a lot of the lives of Indian Muslims. There are many Kashmiris who were Kashmiris and then because of the violence in occupied Kashmir moved to cities like New Delhi, and over generations people know that their ancestral history is in occupied Kashmir, but they're very much assimilated and part of urban India. And I think this is also true of Canada. What is also true is that there is a lot of brutal violence against visibly racialized women and girls in Kashmir, and specifically Muslim girls and women who wear a headscarf, who have Muslim names. And this is also true of, I think, of women whose bodies are marked as being from poor neighborhoods, poor families, poor areas. And this is about the politics of skin color and class. It's really interesting and sometimes confounding to think that people like talking, like especially white liberals, who are white middle class liberals who get tenure at universities and make a lot of money, like talking about decolonization, but they don't like talking about the materiality of race and class. And I think this is something that the feminist movement has always done. The feminist movement has never shied away from discussing the actual politics of the body, of class, of poverty, of the hypersexualization and desexualization of certain groups of women and girls, of the politics of ugliness and beauty. So I'm going to not look at every single slide in the interest of time. Following the gang rape and murder of Asifa Banu in occupied Kashmir, many feminist commentators started to discuss the ways that rape is constructed in the media. The media constitutes a key arena in which rape is defined, shaping perceptions about how sexual violence is viewed in the society and who is held accountable and what assumptions are being conveyed to the audiences about the victims and the perpetrators. So the whole class discusses rape culture, and as do all the readings. And this is because of the course content and because of the very serious nature of these crimes. And the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report obviously discusses rape. So I'm not sure if I need to give a trigger warning, but these lectures will discuss cases of rape and gender-based and sexual violence against women and girls. And I'll also discuss whiteness and in detail. I don't think I need to give do I need to give a trigger warning because I'm brown and I'm going to talk about whiteness and say that I think that Canada is racist? I'm not sure. I don't think that I don't think that that is necessary, but I do think the politics of rape and gender-based violence could be triggering for some, but the whole course content is going to really talk about these cases. Which involve violence. Media constitutes a key arena in which rape is defined, shaping perceptions about how sexual violence is viewed in the society and who is held accountable and what assumptions are being conveyed to the audiences about the victims and the perpetrators. Here I am to explore aspects of news coverage to reveal how the language used in text legitimizes, sustains, and condones violence against women. Rape is a unique crime, for society inflicts more suffering on the victim than the perpetrator, writes Shakuntala Rao in her article covering rape in a shame culture, which focuses on the Indian television media's portrayal of violence against women. She highlights that crimes against women coming from lower socioeconomic strata are not given adequate attention. A woman is raped in India in every other 15, raped in India every 15 minutes. The nation is termed as the rape capital of the world, and the media has termed the crisis of sexual violence as an epidemic. I do take these cases of rape and violence seriously, but what I'm also cognizant of is the politics of victimization. Whiteness often connotes innocence, and I feel as though anytime women of color and working class women of color, immigrant women, or just any women want to discuss gender-based violence and want to talk about Canada as a settler state and as a place that is not safe for women, and particularly for certain women, there is this sense of always needing to say sorry and to tell certain people in positions of privilege and positions of power and to tell white people that they are still innocent and that they are still going to somehow construct themselves as victims for hearing certain language. So I am sorry, and I will give you a whole series of warnings in case people feel as though they're being traumatized by hearing about violence against Indigenous women and girls. According to the National Crime Records Bureau of India, more than 4 Dalit women are raped every day. Dalits and Adivasis are characterized as being among the poorest and most marginalized people of India who do not have title to land. In the case investigated, the woman was raped and murdered in May 2017, and media coverage of this case coincided with the verdict of the 2012 gang rape case in Delhi. Critically, in this case, the victim was familiar with the perpetrator. The focus was on understanding the notions of victimhood, sympathies, and agency by reflecting on the portrayal of the perpetrator, supposed motivations, and the portrayal of the victim. Media has a way of framing certain cases of rape and gender-based violence. And one way you can think about how intersections of gender, race, and class work is by thinking about the media. Writing about media representations of rape in India, this author states that across publications and multiple storylines, the rapist was termed as the jilted lover. The first thing one can draw is the clear establishment of an acquaintance rape scenario and not the conventional horror story narrative. The relationship the two previously shared then becomes a tool to attribute responsibility of the rape to the victim as she had once known the rapist, and not just that, had shown likability towards him, which then gives narrative of the virgin whore dichotomy, indicating that perhaps she was not completely innocent as she liked him once, changed her mind, and later rejected him. This jilted lover or divorce narrative is also about the politics of race and class. So anytime any man with brown skin wants to do something to me or say something to me, we become part of a community. And this is really disturbing if I think about my legal rights and if I think about the politics of the criminal justice system and the possibility of ever having legal rights as a full citizen in Canada. The credibility of the victim gets questioned further when her past relationship status is given inordinate focus. The articles consistently reinforce the fact that she was a divorcee. In India, where marriage is sacrosanct and husbands are Parmeshwars or gods, patriarchy is so deeply ingrained that women are expected to associate themselves with men to command dignity and respect. In this case, there are aspirations raised on her status because the victim is marred by the stain of divorce. This is also about the politics of age. For some reason, I am still a child who constantly has parents, and people constantly ask me about my parents and don't ask me about my adult life. I'm not assumed to be someone who could have an adult romantic life or to be an adult woman. It's always about my parents. So if you thought about the politics of victimization and potential murder, when you are part of a family and you are a non-white woman who is seen to be part of a family, I think it means you're constantly constructed as being part of an immigrant patriarchy and someone who does not have full legal rights or sexual autonomy. By stating that she was a divorcee, the narrative highlights multiple things. She was tainted, and this is an author who's discussing the ways that cases of sexual violence are reported in the Indian media. By stating that she was a divorcee, the narrative highlights multiple things. She was tainted, a fallen woman salaciously forming relationships, but most importantly, gives the impression that she was someone who had transgressed social and cultural norms established for her within the Indian tradition and had chosen to assert herself by choosing a partner of her own choice and then making another choice of rejecting him. So the media also constructs cases of rape and gender-based violence as being really special, and as the perpetrators are really special men who are seen to be monsters or have a lot of issues, rather than seeing rape and gender-based violence as being quite normal. there is a naturalization of male aggression, and toxic masculinity is seen to be the norm. I would also state that caste and caste-based aggression is also normalized when there are instances of violence against Dalit and Adivasi women, and this is also true of how much toxicity and white aggression against people of color is normalized when anyone wants to use women of color as an outlet for aggression. So, feminist standpoint theorists make three principal claims. First, knowledge is socially situated. Second, marginalized groups are socially situated in ways that make it possible for them to be aware of things and ask questions than it is for the non-marginalized. Third, research, particularly that focused on power relations, should begin with the lives of the marginalized. Feminist standpoint theory then makes a contribution to epistemology, to methodological debates in the social and natural sciences, to philosophy of science, and to political activism. It has been one of the most influential and debated theories to emerge from second wave and feminist thinking. So this idea of standpoint is something that Black feminist theorists like Patricia Hill Collins and Dalit feminist theorists like the late Sharmila Regge discussed in detail. And Sharmila Regge is someone who wrote about Dalit feminism. I'm not sure if she was a Dalit. And this idea of identification, I think, is just important. I mean, you can write about anything you want, and freedom of speech exists under law, but what feminist standpoint theorists would argue is that it is important to locate yourself and to be honest about how your experiences frame your positionality and your perspective. So the ways that we perceive of Canada are obviously different depending on how what position we occupy. Things like our embodiment, skin color, gender identity, having a disability, all of these things, and also poverty, whether or not we have a relationship to indigeneity, our positionality in relation to land. And Black feminist standpoint theorists argued that we produce knowledge from a certain position, and no one produces knowledge from an objective, disembodied point of view. So even if you were to think about knowledge about contemporary capitalism in India, it's produced from a particular point of view. So I lived in Bangalore, and I often went to street markets, and I bought things in street markets. And I also lived in Delhi when I wrote a book about gang rape in Section 377, which is part of the syllabus. And even the politics of who sells and who buys and who has formal and informal labor are obviously connected to land and to Hinduism. Caste, I think, is inextricable from land, so upper caste Hindus often have title to land. Many people who are part of the South Asian diaspora have parents who sold their lands to come to Canada, but the land they sold was not land that lower caste people could have ever had title to, but was land that people who are lower caste farmers often worked on. So when I buy things at street markets, sometimes the people who sell them put them all out on blankets, and they're part of India's informal economy. 90% of India's economy is informal, and the problem with street markets is if you want to sell things, you're supposed to have a license. And so you have to purchase things very quickly. And a lot of women who have stalls or who sell things sometimes don't have formal stalls. They'll just put all of their wares on a blanket. You have to buy things very quickly. And the police have started to raid a lot of these markets. And they wrap up the goods very quickly and have to run off. So if you think about what happens over time, the current government in India has passed what is called the Foreign Direct Investment Initiative, and this gives companies that are not Indian companies and that don't support local vendors the right to sell things. And this is why H&M and Zara and 7-Eleven can be found throughout the world. I obviously occupy a certain position as someone who can afford to buy these things because I'm a university professor and because my parents are middle-class Hindus who were part of a diaspora and an English-speaking diaspora. So who can buy and who can sell, and what people buy and sell, meaning the selling of English language intellectual labor and a Canadian PhD, which allows me to teach in India, is obviously about the politics of colonialism and capitalism. So when we produce knowledge about things, we obviously produce knowledge from a certain standpoint. But this doesn't mean that any of us cannot produce knowledge and cannot be cognizant of the position we occupy. So I published a book chapter, a chapter, my chapter is the last chapter of this book, and it is about an artistic work that commemorated the Delhi gang rape case. And there is another chapter in this book that my friends who are academics in India edited. And I was really happy to be part of this book and to know Indian academics who are part of this generation of scholars and left-wing scholars. And the politics of street vending is something that I think is really interesting. And if you're interested in thinking about Indigenous issues and the law and practical questions regarding law and also contemporary Canadian capitalism, you might think about things like street vending. A lot of the class looks at theoretical questions, and we look at large moral questions regarding the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and what it means to be a victim, what it means to also tell the truth. But there are these practical questions that you could also consider in your writing. And if you're interested in law, you might consider the politics of street vending and throughout the world, and who can buy and who can sell. This is also true of street vendors in Latin America. Feminist standpoint theories place relations between political and social power and knowledge center stage. These theories are both descriptive and normative, describing and analyzing the causal effects of power structures on knowledge, while also advocating a specific route for inquiry, a route that begins from standpoints emerging from shared political struggles with marginalized lives. So in a previous lecture, I discussed intersectionality, and the lectures build upon each other. I said my name is pronounced Tara at Lurie. you could say Tara or doctor, but I said that in one of the first lectures I recorded, but I'm not, you might be someone who missed those recordings or isn't watching them in order. So my name is Tara, but you could also call me doctor or professor if you prefer that. So we discussed intersectionality, and Dean Spade's reading is really about intersectionality and Black feminist theory. Feminist epistemology and feminist standpoint theories are connected to the previous lecture where I discussed theory and the production of knowledge. Epistemology is that section of philosophy concerned with the production of knowledge. Feminist epistemologies initially were concerned with the production of knowledge that objectified women in the production of knowledge. So the reason feminist epistemology exists is because throughout history, there have always been efforts to stop women from thinking, from going to school, from reading, from writing, and from producing knowledge, and from speaking our own truth. New developments in feminist thought have expanded on that premise to assert women as central to the production of knowledge through our standpoint as subjects, rather than accepting the traditional masculine bias that pushes women's knowledge to the periphery. In reviewing second wave feminism in India and the Dalit movement, Datar recognizes the importance of anti-rape agitation, but views sexual politics as a stray tendency within feminism. So my discussion of the relationship between caste and Adivasi or tribal peoples in India is obviously very incomplete and shallow because it is not something I've researched in detail. Who has title to land is obviously a massive question. And one of the things that some of my friends have tried to do is to get law degrees and to explore these questions about land and who has title to land in detail using the law and the Indian law. But in order to really think about the relationship between caste and gender-based violence, which is most extreme against women who are not upper caste and who has title to land, one would need to do a localized research study so that who is an Adivasi? I mean, Adivasis and tribal people and Dalit people are not all the same. Like all of these categorizations are different, but they're overlapping and intersecting politics in terms of class position, title to land, and gender-based violence in many regions. It's very difficult to speak in generalities when you're talking about such a large country like India. But there are obviously patterns of behavior against minority women that one can see in the same way that Black women and Indigenous women and girls experience high rates of violence and are statistically more likely to experience violence. And there are also obviously things that one can just see in terms of who is represented in the Indian media, who is most likely to be hired, who lives in certain neighborhoods. So Dalit feminist standpoint theory argues that a thoroughgoing analysis of the material basis of patriarchy requires that the differential access to and control over labor, sexuality, and reproduction by castes, classes, and communities be brought to center. In the absence of such critiques of Brahmanical class-based heteropatriarchies, the political edge of sexual politics is lost. I think that queer politics and two-spirit politics um, is always really about questions of class, land, um, inheritance, and the future, uh, particularly who is thought to be the future family, the future mother of a country, the future citizen. And one way to think about intersectionality is to think about queerness as being central to any analysis of violence against women and girls, and of whose body is thought to have rights, uh, and easily mocked or becomes invisible. So one's relationship to heteronormative patriarchal structures is often how people secure inheritance, title to lands, and what Dalit feminist standpoint theory argues is that we should have an analysis of who has access to and control over these processes of labor, sex, reproduction. I mean, in its simplest form, when we talk about sexual politics and feminist politics, we can ask who is going to become middle class and who is going to have a middle class family and who is not. As I've quoted before, Frantz Fanon once said, "You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich." What feminist standpoint theory does is to argue for the importance of situated knowledges rather than objectivity. That when one experiences violence, they are perhaps in a position to understand violence in ways that someone could not as an external observer. This is also true of a material geography, that when you live in a certain place, I think you can you can produce situated knowledge in that place. I mean, anyone can write whatever they want and produce whatever knowledge they want. The point is that feminist epistemology and Black feminist epistemology does also exist alongside a lot of what would be called positivist or objective theory. So in the interest of time, I'm going to just turn to the last section, or I'm going to, I guess I'll skip ahead a few slides and then I will continue the lecture in another video because it's going to be too long. I hope this is interesting and you gain something from it. The point with these kind of liberal arts and humanities classes is not to think about someone as speaking the truth, but as just offering opinions, ideas, and a certain reading of texts. And anyone can offer opinions, ideas, and a certain reading of texts along with their own personal lived experience and from their own subject position. So I'll finish then by just discussing Black feminist standpoint theory in more detail. And then next time, I'll discuss the article on your syllabus, which offers a critique of the victim-centered approach in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'll discuss the relationship between what the author of the reading on your syllabus is stating about the critique of a victim-centered approach and feminist standpoint theory. So I guess the question is, when we produce knowledge from our own individual subject position, do we fail to hold other people accountable? So if I constantly just talk about my own experiences as a woman of color, as someone who is part of an Indian diaspora, and as someone who's part of the diaspora who's returned to India to teach in India, I mean, do I then ignore all of these structures of state power that inform my capacity to even produce knowledge in the English language? If I only discuss my own experiences of victimization, then do I refuse to discuss whiteness or masculinity or someone who's perpetrated a crime against me? Like, this is one of the questions that the author asks about this constant focus on victim-centered narratives as opposed to other modes of narrative. And one question they ask is repeatedly about the truth and whether or not a victim-centered approach to collecting information or narratives is really about truth. So I'll finish then this half by discussing Black feminist standpoint theory. Black feminist thought is a collection of ideas, writing, and art that articulates a standpoint of and for Black women of the African diaspora. Black feminist thought describes Black women as a unique group that exists in a place in US social relations where intersectional processes such as race, ethnicity, gender, class, and sexual orientation shape Black women's individual and collective consciousness, self-definitions, and actions. As a standpoint theory, Black feminist thought conceptualizes identities as organic, fluid, interdependent, multiple, and dynamic socially constructed locations within historical context. Black feminist thought is grounded in Black women's historical experience with enslavement, anti-lynching movements, segregation, civil rights, and Black power movements, sexual politics, capitalism, and patriarchy. Feminist standpoint theories, which originated in the standpoint of women, have been revisioned as it became apparent that the constitution of the subject woman is the result of a complex interplay of individual and large-scale social forces. Dalit feminist standpoint theory, like any other standpoint, therefore, is not to be seen in terms of aggregates of individuals. It is a collective subject position that requires an always contingent transformation of complex subject positions. So this idea of collective standpoint is also interesting because it is not about individualism, but it is about seeing one's standpoint from a politicized vantage point. So a feminist standpoint is not the same as just a standpoint that is about gender as biology or, to see the world from a standpoint, to see the world from a feminist standpoint requires a political identification with the feminist movement. So again, it comes back to this point that I think is important, that it is important to base your identity on your politics rather than your politics on your identity. I'll finish then with this quote by Weeks, who is quoted in Sharmila Rege's article. The standpoint is a project, not an inheritance. It is achieved, not given. Okay, so that's the first half of the lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Sometimes I make dramatic claims about identity politics, and I hope it's entertaining. I think the politics should be provocative.